Hello and welcome to BHP's Shareholder Q&A, which follows the announcement of our results for the 2024 financial year in August. I'm Belinda Ford and I'm here with BHP's Chief Executive Officer Mike Henry and our Chief Financial Officer Vandita Pant, who joins this forum for the first time following her first full year results. Welcome, Vandita.
Thank you.
This year we've received lots of questions from shareholders covering a broad range of topics. But Mike, before we get into the questions, perhaps I can ask you to start with a few of your reflections on the numbers and also what you've been hearing from some of our major shareholders.
Sure, so it's a strong set of results, but before I talk to them in detail, I do need to acknowledge that during the course of the year, one of our colleagues tragically lost his life while on the job. And this is a very heavy reminder of the imperative that we continue our efforts to eliminate fatalities and significant injuries from BHP. This is something that I and the management team are taking with utmost seriousness, and it's something that's getting all of our focus. Now, if I turn to our results for the half and the year, they've been received quite well by the market. So between Vandita, myself, and other members of the management team, we've just come back from a few weeks on the road speaking to our largest shareholders around the world. And the feedback has been positive. There's clear recognition of our operational excellence and how that's leading to better returns for shareholders. A lot of support for how the discipline with which we're applying the capital allocation framework, and positive feedback on the actions that we're taking around the portfolio to create more growth optionality, in particular in those commodities that stand to benefit from some of the big megatrends that are playing out around us. Now, alongside that, we are getting some questions. So how are we seeing commodity markets? They've obviously been volatile lately, so shareholders want to understand the impacts of that. The flip side of this much better growth optionality that we have in the portfolio is that shareholders are now also saying, well, how do we go about funding this over time? What's the right pace of investment in that growth? How do we sequence those options and so on? But these are obviously positive questions for us to be receiving. And overall, as I said, feedback from shareholders was very positive, recognizing our underlying performance. They like the fact that we're continuing to execute against a very clear, simple strategy, doing so consistently, and that's generating the sort of cash flows that have allowed us to pay our fourth highest dividend ever for the full year at $1.46.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to move now to questions from our shareholders, and starting first with copper. Stefan asks, please let me know information about expansion of Olympic Dam. How far has the planning progressed, and when will the expansion of copper production take place? And we've also had questions from shareholders on the number of copper growth options we recently announced and how we intend to fund and sequence those.
So I'll start by saying that we are so much better placed today than we were a few years ago in terms of growth optionality in the portfolio, both potash and copper. And so a big focus of our results presentation this time was on the copper optionality in the portfolio and revealing more detail about copper growth options in Chile, in South Australia, and a more recent acquisition that we've made in Argentina. And so against that backdrop, we've had questions from shareholders, positive feedback, as I said. People are looking for more detail about how we sequence those options. And the explanation that Vandita and I have given to the market is that our capital allocation framework, first put in place in 2016, really helps guide us around what the appropriate sequencing of those options are and how quickly we want to be executing them. And as a reminder, the capital allocation framework helps us determine how to allocate excess cash between inorganic growth, organic growth, more returns to shareholders, strengthening the balance sheet, and so on. And it forces a competition between capital to create the greatest value and returns for shareholders long term. But as I started with, lots of growth optionality, so this is a great conundrum for us to resolve. In the coming months and years, I'm really optimistic about the growth outlook for the company. Now, there was a specific question in there on Olympic Dam and what the production forecast is there going forward. And it's probably best to look at that as copper South Australia, so not just Olympic Dam. And as part of these results, we did speak about the intent to build a two-stage smelter at Olympic Dam, or convert the smelter there to two-stage, alongside some expansion of mining capacity to allow us to reach 500,000 tons per annum copper cathode production by the end of this decade, early next, with then an opportunity to increase that to 650,000 tons by the middle of next decade. We expect to be able to take an investment decision on that first kind of uplift in production in FY 2027.
Thanks, Mike. Vandita, I might hand this one to you. And it's on the balancing act that Mike just talked about. Joseph asks, why does BHP keep dropping its dividend payout percentage, effectively prioritising cash flow away from shareholders to other capital priorities?
So first thing I will ask Joe to consider is actually our dividend policy hasn't changed in many, many years. As Mike was referring to our capital allocation framework, it guides a minimum payout ratio of 50% for dividends. Then we have excess cash and we see how to allocate that between growth, additional returns to shareholders, which can be buybacks or dividends, or indeed put it on the balance sheet. If I were to take a view of dividends, balance sheet and growth since we started our capital allocation framework in 2016, almost half of all cash generated, 48%, has actually gone back to the shareholders. And then we have invested another 38% in real value adding growth projects. And then 12% going back to the balance sheet to make sure we have that financial resilience, which for a company of our size is absolutely a must. And if I were to take a nearer term view, in last 3 years, we have been one of the highest dividend payers across industries globally. If I were to include the dividend that we just announced of $3.8 billion with the full year results, our shareholder returns in dividends in the last 3 years have been $42 billion.
Vandita, perhaps you could also answer this question from Nicola, and she says, what are BHP's plans for share buybacks over the next 5 years?
Sure. I'll link it to my previous question. Share buybacks are definitely part of the consideration set every 6 months as we execute on our capital allocation framework. So as I was mentioning, the excess cash flow which is there, we decide how much goes to the additional returns to the shareholders. And then the second question is in which form. It could be additional dividends or share buyback program as well. The last share buyback we did was in FY19, and that will continue to be a consideration as we go forward every 6 months.
We've got a few questions here on portfolio, which I might throw to you, Mike. Jill asks, BHP's revenue and profits are currently dominated by iron ore. Copper and potash have much greater potential for growth in the long term. Can you foresee, say in the next 10 years, these commodities outranking iron ore in their profit contribution to the group? And we've got one from Dominic who says, which resources will BHP be focusing on in the future?
Look, this is such an important question because at the end of the day, the construct of the portfolio is what underpins long-term shareholder returns. And certainly in both copper and potash, we're going to have great businesses going forward. But let me start with how we've thought about the portfolio overall. So over the past few years, shareholders have seen us execute a divestment of our petroleum business for value and choice for shareholders, a consolidation of our coal portfolio into those coals that are going to be increasingly needed by steelmakers as they seek to decarbonize their operations, and a divestment of some of our lower quality coals, again for value, alongside an announcement to move New South Wales Energy Coal towards closure in 2030. And at the same time as we've had that underway, we've acquired Oz Minerals, which is a copper-focused acquisition. We've recently acquired a new opportunity in Argentina, giving us early access to what could potentially be a long-term, very attractive copper basin. And as part of this results, we've revealed more detail around the copper growth options that we're progressing at Escondida in Chile and in copper South Australia as we integrate the Oz Minerals assets into the BHP portfolio. That increased copper optionality stands alongside increased growth optionality in our potash business in Canada, where we have Jansen Stage 1 and now Jansen Stage 2, both in execution. And those are going to make us one of the world's largest potash suppliers by the end of this decade or early next. Overall, what that is going to give us is a portfolio that has the world's lowest cost iron ore business, which has improved product quality as a result of our investment in South Flank. We're currently generating $10 per ton more free cash flow than our biggest competitor. So that's a business that's going to stand us in good stead long term. We have a high quality steel making coal business in Queensland and increased growth in future facing commodities through potash and copper. So this is a very resilient portfolio and one that's going to allow us to deliver great returns for shareholders over the decades to come.
I've got a follow-up here from Jill, which I'll ask you, Vandita. Will copper and potash significantly reduce BHP's vulnerability to China? And Patricia asks, and it's related, in view of the general and sizable downturn in China's economy, how do you consider this will affect BHP's balance sheet?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, I should say that China is a very important market for BHP and will continue to be so for a long time to come. 60% of our revenue right now comes from China, and we have great relationships in the country across our commodity set. We have still a very diversified customer base. I will take an example of our steel making coal, and 3/4 of that goes to India, Japan, and rest of Asia, for example. India is really growing its steel making capacity very rapidly, and from where it is today to end of 2050 odd, we think India grows its steel making almost 4 times, and will also become double the size of world's GDP contribution wise by 2050 from where it is today. If I talk about the resilience of the balance sheet is really important. As economic conditions and volatility of the cycles we face at any point in time, BHP is in a fantastic shape because we are in the middle of our $5 to $15 billion of net debt range. That makes our balance sheet really strong, which gives us the ability to have resilience as well as be able to really allocate the cash towards both returns as well as growth going forward. Our portfolio of commodities is another source of resilience because our commodities are such that they are really leveraged to the mega trends for decades to come, and hence give a real positive outlook for those commodities, along with our real way of doing operational excellence, which allows our assets to be on the lower end of the cost curve, which is another source of resilience.
Staying with you, Vandita, Stephen from Canada is excited to hear about the Jansen project's progress and asks, are you still bullish on the potash market going forward? And will you please update us on the status of the timeline and budget? And he's also asked for, is the project on track and is it on budget?
Sure. So Stephen, very excited about our entry into potash. Jansen, of course, is a world-class resource in potash and in a very investment-friendly country. Jansen 1 going really well. It's in fact ahead of schedule, and first production will be by end of 26. Jansen 2 had just started and going well as well. In terms of potash as a commodity, very attractive continues to be, as Mike was mentioning earlier, it really is predicated on these mega trends of population growth, standard of living increasing with higher calorie value and more crop yield required from less arable land. And hence, the demand dynamics of potash remain very attractive, and we will be, by Jansen 1 and 2, by the time it ramps up, almost 10% of the market.
Thanks, Vandita. One for you, Mike, which comes from Hugh, who asks, what action is BHP taking to tackle the climate crisis and to achieve net zero emissions for BHP's Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 2050?
So look, great question. And I would start by saying that BHP has been focused on reducing operational emissions since the 1990s. So this has now been a multi-decade effort, and it's one of the reasons why we're positioned today with amongst the lowest absolute emissions of any of the major mining companies. But the efforts continue. And in fact, we've just released our second climate transition action plan. That'll be up for discussion and vote at our upcoming AGM, so would encourage everybody to have a look at that. But what we set out in there, and consistent with the first plan of 3 years ago, is a target to achieve 30% reduction in our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so our operational emissions, in absolute terms by 2030 relative to a 2020 baseline. And we're on track. In fact, we've already reduced by about 32%. Now, the obvious question will be, well, if you've achieved 32%, are you not going to overachieve by 2030? The only caution I would give is that it's not going to be a straight line, as we've explained in some recent presentations to the market. That 30% reduction is over and above, or it needs to offset and more growth in the underlying portfolio. And I spoke earlier about the ambitious growth plans or intent that we have over the remainder of this decade. We have to offset all of that and achieve a 30% absolute reduction. So that's a pretty big effort. And so far we've achieved it by a move to renewable power into our operations. The next big wave of reducing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions will come through electrification of our equipment on site, the big mining trucks, our trains and so on. That's a bigger technological challenge for us, but we're making progress, working together with the equipment manufacturers, and we're confident that we'll meet our 2030 target, and that will keep us on track to achieving our 2050 ambition to be net zero Scope 1 and Scope 2. Now, of course, we also focus on Scope 3 emissions. So the emissions that reside elsewhere in our supply chain, in transport, in end use of our products. And a couple of the things I would talk about there are our work with steelmakers. We have agreements in place with 9 steelmakers accounting for 20% of global steel supply, where we contribute both financially and technically to their efforts to reduce their carbon footprint in blast furnace steel production. In the case of shipping, we've worked with shipping companies to develop world-first dual-fueled bulk carriers of a certain type. These are the big vessels that carry our iron ore and our coal, where we've worked with them to implement what are called dual-fueled vessels, where they can run both on bunkers, which is the traditional fuel, as well as LNG, which has a lower emissions footprint. So we've pioneered that as 2 examples of the many things that we're doing on the Scope 3 front to help others in our supply chain reduce their emissions.
This is a question from Bruce in Ecuador, and I'll ask you to take this one, Vandita. Will any of your future environment efforts include participation in carbon credits, biodiversity credits, or biocultural credits, including in Latin America?
Sure. Thanks, Bruce, for the question. For our medium-term targets that Mike just talked about to FY 2030, we intend to really look at those targets and achieve those targets through structural abatement at our assets. Barring anything unanticipated, we will use only that kind of lever of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 reductions rather than relying on carbon credits. If I were to look at longer term, there could be a potential that we have to, for hard to abate part of our carbon footprint, need to use some carbon credits. But if so, then we will use our yardstick of high integrity standards for those carbon credits. I should mention here that we will be using regulatory carbon credits in compliance to the Australian safeguard mechanism.
Keeping on the topic of climate, perhaps one for you, Mike. What is BHP doing to reduce methane emissions, and is it enough?
Oh, okay, so this probably requires a bit of explanation up front, in that what the question is referring to is fugitive emissions in our coal operations. And so in the act of mining coal, methane gets released. And methane is a greenhouse gas. It's a more intense greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, which is what oftentimes people focus on. Our coal mines have a lower methane intensity than most coal mines out there. So again, we're starting in a good place, but it's something that does require ongoing attention. Now, when it comes to underground coal mines, for example, our Broadmeadow mine, this is often addressed through releasing gas in advance of mining, so drilling and releasing the gas, and in our case we then flare that gas to change the methane into the lower greenhouse gas intensity carbon dioxide. The real challenge then comes with open cut coal mining, where it's harder to capture, or it's not currently technically feasible to capture the methane. There are studies underway to the opportunities to degas in front of or ahead of mining, but that hasn't been done at large scale within open cut coal mining to date. Now, we've had a couple of studies underway in Queensland, and we continue to look at both the opportunities to do that as well as to look at other methane abatement technologies that can be deployed. Right now, a lot of our focus is on understanding the nature of the methane in our resource. So there's a fairly significant drilling campaign underway currently to understand that better, to then be able to plan for how we go about both mitigating and preventing this going forward.
I'll move to a topic that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and we've had a number of questions on this one, and that's the global nickel market. I'll ask you to address these, Vandita, if I could, and I'll just go through them in sequence. We've got Austin, who asks, BHP has a focus on future minerals over the long term. How then did BHP miss the risk of China nickel in Indonesia? And Akira asks, what is the company's plan to identify similar risks much earlier in the future? And finally, Alistair asks, how will BHP adapt to be competitive and profitable with the increase of Indonesia's smelting capacity and a resource wage ratio of 20:1 and a production cost of $1,500 per tonne less than Australia?
Okay, a lot in there, so let me take it in parts. Firstly, on nickel prices. There is always demand and supply element to that. On demand, we continue to believe that nickel has very attractive growth profile over decades to come. Then on supply side, we, along with many in the industry, did undercall the growth in Indonesian supply. That has come in faster, more, and at much lower cost than we anticipated. The result is a downward pressure and really challenging market dynamics in nickel currently, and that has led to a very difficult and complex decision for us in Western Australia to call temporary suspension of our operations, which was losing a lot of money. So now from here, where do we go? We are continuing to invest in that business to make sure that we have an option to return and restart the operation if and when the markets allow us to do so. We will continue to monitor the signposts of how the market is developing, which we think the market balance and oversupply does not correct itself till later half of this later part of this decade. We have talked about we'll take a decision in February 2027 of how the market is developing, and if the dynamics are right, to allow restart to happen with an opportunity to rebase our cost base as well. Really important that the operation, if it were to come in, is competitive as mentioned in the question. If I were to now say what are the lessons we take out of this experience, I would say a few things. Firstly, nickel is a very small market. It's less than 1/10 of a copper market, for example. And that does mean that disruption can be easily done than a very large market, which continues to be the case for most of our portfolio. Secondly, the importance of signposts that we do have becomes very important, and we continue to be very diligent around signpost monitoring in our commodities as well. And thirdly, nothing to do with the forecast, but in terms of resilience of business, this is a good lesson that low cost base and productivity driven agenda becomes so critical when the assets are at low end of the cost curve and can be really competitive on global stage. Otherwise, it does become really difficult as the commodity markets go through volatility.
Moving now from nickel to iron ore, and this one's for Mike. It's from Sonia, and she asks about Simandou. First ore on belt in 2025 at Simandou mine will produce iron ore that no iron ore asset in the Pilbara can compete with. It will also eventually scale to produce some replacement Pilbara tonnes. Given the impending impact to iron ore of both quality and quantity, what is the 5 to 10 year plan for WAIO in terms of production profile?
Well, look, so actually the prior question provides a good segue to this one, in that the prior question was about how do we think about commodities long term, how do we better predict what's coming towards us and fold that into our strategy. And in the case of Simandou and iron ore markets more generally, for over a decade now, we've been anticipating that Simandou and other new supply would come to the market. And we've also said that supply is going to come to a market at a time where China has moved past its early industrialization phase, which tends to be more steel intensive. So steel demand would begin to plateau, ultimately start to decline at the same time as we saw new supply coming to market. And it was this thinking or this prediction that saw us back in 2017 say, okay, we have to ensure that we've got the lowest cost iron ore business in the world, and we have to improve the overall quality of the product offering that we have for our customers. And that resulted in a pretty intense and ongoing effort to become the sector's best operator, sharp focus on operational excellence, and for us to develop the South Flank mine, which had slightly higher iron content and a greater lump fraction, which is a premium product than the average product at the time. That's now positioned us to a point where for the past 4 years, as Vandita said earlier, we've had the lowest cost iron ore business out there. In fact, we're generating $10 US per ton more free cash flow than our largest competitor in this business. And that position is going to ensure that even in a future market where competition is heated up, we're going to be very well positioned with a strong business generating good returns for BHP and for our shareholders.
Another question for you, Mike, and this one's from Alan in the United States, who asks, do you see any realistic path forward towards resolution of the Resolution copper stalemate?
So for everybody's benefit, Resolution is one of the world's largest, most attractive undeveloped copper deposits. And in fact, it could supply 25% of the US's copper demand if it were developed. Now, BHP owns 45% of that project. Rio Tinto is the other 55%, and they manage the project. The project's currently still in its permitting phase. It's under feasibility study. And Rio mentioned in their first half financial results that they're continuing to focus on engaging local First Nations stakeholders as well as communities towards securing their support for the development of Resolution. It's one of the number of attractive options in the BHP portfolio for copper growth alongside Escondida in Chile, Copper South Australia, as well as the opportunity that we've recently entered in Argentina, the Filo resource.
Staying on copper, and on the subject of the joint venture in Argentina, a shareholder asks, Mike, does that mean that BHP is no longer interested in Anglo American?
Well, so interesting one. And at the time, I was at pains to say that our attempt to acquire our proposal for Anglo was not plan A for the company. We thought that there was a real opportunity for BHP shareholders and Anglo shareholders to unlock further value. But we didn't get the engagement that we were seeking. They've since announced their own plan, which they're off executing. And we continue to focus on plan A. And you can see the benefit or the results of plan A shining through in the strong results that we've had this half, building upon quite a number of periods now of strong operational and financial results. And what we've revealed even more of through this set of results is the strong growth optionality that we have over the coming decade, not just in potash, but also in copper in a number of jurisdictions around the world.
Thanks, Mike and Vandita, for your time. Mike, any final thoughts before we close?
I hope our shareholders recognize that the company is in great shape. It's performing well operationally, very, very reliably, delivering strong financial results period on period. And from a portfolio perspective, we're making great and continued progress on shaping a BHP portfolio to the future, where we're more leveraged to future-facing commodities that stand to benefit from the megatrends that are unfolding around us. And through that, we're ensuring that we'll be able to deliver great returns for shareholders well into the future.
And if I may say to our shareholders as well, that 3rd October is the date when the payment of dividends starts to come through.
Thanks, Vandita and Mike. A reminder that this presentation will be available on bhp.com. And thank you again to everyone for your questions, and goodbye for now.